morning, everybody. Just wait for our last people to settle down. Morning. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on trauma in the land. Thank you so much for coming on this frosty, very early morning, it feels like. Before we start, I'd really like to dedicate this discussion to the late Marina O'Connell, who was a pioneering biodynamic farmer in a education centre and farm called the Apricot Centre down in the south of Devon. So to her and her husband Mark, who really initiated this stream of work on trauma in the land. So my name is Rachel Fleming. I come from an organisation called the Animate Earth Collective. We've been working with this conference and the kind of conference team over the last couple of years to really bring understanding of how we might develop a deeper conversation and relationship with the other than human world and how we might listen to the land. So out of that, we have booked this panel this morning on trauma in the land. And really, there are so many ways and directions we could go with trauma in the land. But this morning, we're really looking very specifically about what we mean by trauma in the land itself. Can the land actually hold trauma, and what does that mean for us as humans and plants and animals that live on it, work with it, eat food from it? So that's the trajectory we're going on. And my esteemed panel today, we have Patrick MacManaway, who I'm sure a lot of you will know. He is a trained medical doctor, if I may say that, or trained in medicine anyway. He's a dowser, he's a third-generation psychic and intuitive. He works with farmers around the world to look at how to bring their farms and businesses and organisations into harmony. Sorry, that wasn't very articulate. So, Patrick, welcome. Thank you for coming. Everybody. Colin Campbell, who was brought up and initiated into some of the old wisdom traditions of Africa, and actually is one of the last surviving lineage holders of those traditions today. So he's bringing an Indigenous African perspective into this discussion on trauma in the land. Then we have Jill Purce, I guess a lot of you will also know, who is an author and a pioneer of the healing voice, so using ancient chanting methods for healing, but also systemic constellations, working with families on ancestral trauma. So, welcome everybody. Hopefully we can have a good go at this very big subject. First of all, Colin, I'll come to you then, from kind of an Indigenous perspective, to really ask what it is that you think that we mean by trauma in the land. What is it? How does it get there? Does it exist?
Thank you, Rachel. And yeah, it's lovely to be here, and I appreciate being asked to come and speak with everybody here, so thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, again, we're opening a very big subject here, and I think that in my experience of it is that different cultures have different interpretations of what trauma is, and how trauma is experienced, and how trauma is identified and worked with. But in the end, it seems to have a commonality, and one of those commonalities is that essentially, if we accept that creation, the universe, is a vast, infinite web of interaction, and we say from an animate point of view that it's relational interaction, that there's a relationship within all of these interactions, then the extent to which the movement of that interaction, the interchange of that interaction in some way breaks down or closes out, then and becomes encapsulated or isolated from its interactive context, then we could say that there's a sense of trauma in that. a trauma builds up. So trauma has at its root a relational isolation, both within oneself and in relation to others. And we can speak about that at any level. We can speak about it in terms of our interaction as people between each other, our interaction from ourselves into the rest of nature. And we can also understand it in terms of the interactions within nature herself and the land. It is possible for areas, for places to somehow close out or become closed out as a result of conditions that have resulted in an encapsulating or a way in which that place becomes isolated. And that isolation, that encapsulation becomes a node of what we might refer to as trauma. How we identify that and how we recognize it and how we work with it and understand it is a completely different matter, but I think at its basic level, that's the way I would see it.
Brilliant, thank you, Colin. So, Patrick, can I come to you? Because I know you have kind of a specific understanding of trauma from your work, and the label that I imagine you might put on it is geopathic stress. Handing that over to you to disagree with me. Or...
Thank you. Well, I think Colin articulated that absolutely beautifully, and I would agree. Generically, we could define health as a state of energy moving in a gentle, flowing, balanced fashion, and stress or trauma where energy has become stagnant, frozen, disconnected, or sometimes moving too quickly in a wiry state of hamster wheel energy. But certainly that sense of losing its interactive flow. In landscape, through the lens that I work through, two sources of trauma. First is physical trauma, where quarrying, mining, construction have disturbed the flow and balance of energies in the landscape. The Chinese were horrified when the Victorians started putting railways across their landscape and cutting across the dragon's veins and the pathways of qi, the dragon lines, the ley lines in their landscape. So landscape energy can be traumatized through physical process or through human emotional intense process. So I get to look a lot at the energy in locations where there's been a battlefield, massacre, rape, suicide, murder, or at a lesser degree residuals from personal trauma and loss, bankruptcies, despair, displacement. So either through intense emotional human experience or through physical trauma, we leave footprints in the sand, and the etheric matrix of place absorbs and holds the pattern of our thoughts and our feelings, good, bad, or indifferent. We place our psychic boundaries, we set our intentions, we craft harmonious energy, but equally that web of etheric matrix will hold a trauma pattern equally. And once a space is traumatized, well, any space holds then a background energy and tone that we tend to, just like elevator music, fall into rhythm with. If we're not paying attention, my daughter occasionally grabs hold of me in a supermarket to stop me bouncing around the aisle for dancing with the background music. So there's an inclination for people to respond to. So if a place is holding a lot of trauma, it brings that out of the people who are there. We tend to be responsive, reactive to the place. And so in that way it becomes self-replicating because it brings out the same pattern in current occupants. So often a place will have a repeating history, because once a trauma pattern's set, it'll tend to invite and invoke the same patterns over again.
Great, thank you. And just coming back to you for a moment, Colin, is that the same understanding in kind of traditional?
Yes, to a point. I think, going back to this notion of isolation. So, when, well, let's say for now, a place becomes isolated, what happens is it loses its interactive participation in place around it. It becomes encapsulated, and within that encapsulation, it begins to function in its own autonomous way, and that creates its own particular version of intensity, and that intensity can mount and is not in keeping with the environment within which it is. So it's an intensity that would seem completely of its own, as opposed to within the balance of everything else. So it becomes a hotspot of intensity, in a sense, and just as you were saying, Patrick, there's a resonance with anything, because we're all in a relational space, and by all I mean absolutely everything and everyone. And as soon as we come in contact with a space, a place that is in this particular intensity, we begin to resonate with that intensity. So there's a kind of infectiousness that happens. And we experience that. And we would potentially, I suppose, in our way of seeing, we would register that as trauma. It would be because it would have a traumatic impact on us. We have certain biomarkers that are triggered. And when those biomarkers are triggered and we struggle to explain what they are, and if we recognize that they happen in relation to a particular place, then we begin to experience that as traumatic.
Okay, brilliant. So coming to you now, Jill, because I know you've got a story kind of a particular trauma that's happened in these islands. So
yes. So it's great to be here, and thank you. And I'm amazed by this conference, and I agree totally with what's been said. But I did want to talk about something very specific. And as Rachel said, I work with ancestral and transgenerational traumas with families. And so my discovery really started with working with people who'd inherited, in England, people who'd inherited farms. And I found that their constellations were completely chilling. And so I began to investigate and to find out why this might be, particularly with one of these people. And what I discovered was something which is very specific and which has only been really revealed last year. There's really a book of collected essays about this, half of which are by the editor. And that is the English insatiable need for human bones. So all through the 19th century, all the battlefields, which means there were 60 Napoleonic battles. There's the Crimean War, there's various Russian wars, the American War of Independence, the First World War even. So human bones were collected on a kind of industrial scale. And particularly imported into England. England had this insatiable desire for bones. And this was morally reprehensible, and people made it illegal. But because it was commercially so important, both for the people who collected the bones, who were very poor in general, and made a few pennies by collecting bones, but also the industrialists who did this on a massive scale. So, for example, in the Battle of Waterloo, there were something like 20,000 dead. And there were very specifically known places where there were pits where they'd been put. And they've discovered 2 skeletons only. One was discovered in 2005, I think, and one in 2012 and one in 2022. 2 skeletons out of over 20,000 dead and all the horses. And so what they discovered was that these were imported into England in this massive scale, and also bones from cemeteries, so ecclesiastical bodies approved this, going back to the Middle Ages. All the sacred sites of colonial spots in Africa and India, Australia, places, were all raided, and the bones imported, particularly into Hull. And plague pits were raided, the bones of plague victims. There was one behind the National Gallery in London, and the bones were collected, ground up, and put in Kensington Gardens. So everybody tried to make this illegal. They disapproved of it, but nevertheless, because it was so commercially successful, the powers that be just turned a blind eye. And the other importation, when human bones were becoming scarcer, in spite of all these battlefields, including, as I mentioned, the First World War. And in the First World War, I think there were 2 million Germans dead, and 80% of those bodies disappeared completely. So they imported mummies from Egypt. Human mummies, ancient bodies, and cat mummies. And I hope it's going to work. I sent it last night. It's not a very good pic. Oh, it's there. So I don't know if you can see that, but there is an auction, and the man auctioning is holding up a cat mummy, and he's using the head of a mummified cat as a gavel, and he's auctioning the entire cat mummy cemetery in 1890. Thank you. And then the next one, this is a bit better. This one shows the cat mummies in their winding cloths kind of going woo and frightening the farmers, and it says the horrible result of Egyptian fertilizer. So this was a contemporary cartoon of Punch. It started out with a few bone mills in places like Hull, but eventually there were bone mills in all the ports and all the great towns, all the main towns in England. And then the other thing that happened was in the 1830s, when Britain stopped the importation of sugar cane, it was discovered in Europe that sugar beet could provide for the democratization of sugar. With the agricultural and industrial revolution, the hunger for sugar was huge and was met by sugar beet. And what they found was that the best way of purifying it was through human bone charcoal. So all sugar was decolorized. The beet was decolorized and purified by charcoal made of human bones. And so in the 1830s, there was this bone rush. What was it called? The bone rush, the bone boom. It was called spodium. So it was used for purifying sugar. So I have these wonderful quotes, actually, which I haven't got time to read them. If you're not careful, you're eating the bones of your ancestors if you have cups of coffee. Watch it. And the amazing thing is that this is so little known. It's only just being revealed. So in 1822, the writer, under the pseudonym of A Living Soldier, said, "It is estimated that more than 1 million bushels of human and inhuman bones were imported last year from the continent of Europe into the port of Hull, the neighbourhood of Leipzig, Austerlitz, Waterloo, and all of the places where, during the late Bloody War, the principal battles were fought, have been swept alike of the bones of the hero and of the horse which he rode. Thus collected from every quarter," they're probably largely male bones. Anyway, "thus collected from every quarter, they had been shipped to the port of Hull and thence forwarded to the Yorkshire bone grinders, who have erected steam engines and powerful machinery for the purpose of rendering them to a granular state. In this condition, they are sent chiefly to Doncaster, one of the largest agricultural markets in that part of the country, and are there sold to farmers to manure their land. And then another quick quote. This was a slightly ironic, and it was written later by a Czech satirist. If you're going to fall in war someday, from each of your bones will be produced 1/2 kilo of bone ash, more than 2 kilos from each man, legs and paws taken together, and in the sugar factory, sugar will be filtrated through you. You don't know at all how useful you will be for your offspring, even after your death. Your sons are going to drink coffee that has been sweetened with sugar that has gone through your bones. I think so to myself somehow that bone ash made from the gentleman officers has to be more expensive than one made from the ordinary soldier. And then just one more thing. And then in the 1830s, this is when it was used as bone charcoal. But then afterwards, it was then put on the fields. So, in other words, the fields, particularly of England and then Scotland, and then 20 years later of Europe, were covered in the bones of those who fought for their countries without their knowing. And so this is, huge trauma. And just one thing that you mentioned about battlefields, one of the things that has been discovered about battlefields, the site of battlefields, is they become accident black spots.
Mm. Wow. So we're all suddenly pushing our coffee away. So what kind of impact, so that's one horror story really, Patrick, what kind of impact is that going to have then on people, animals, plants, food, using that as a particular example, and there will be many more. What's the impact?
Yes. Measurably on plants, tend to get stunting, failure to thrive, reduced germination, reduced yields. People who've heard me speak before will remember a story of a sorghum crop that was planted 2 weeks after I cleared a massacre site. And their previous average had been 1 tonne per acre. Their previous best had been 1.6 tonnes per acre. And this crop came in at 2.3 tonnes per acre. And that wasn't making it go faster. That was what it should always have been. And the clients had described this property to me as being Rolls-Royce property with no spark plugs. And all the mineralogical carbon analysis all looked good using biodynamics, radionics, etc. So 2.3 tonnes per acre, previous best 1.6 tonnes per acre. That was the margin of life force that was unavailable to the plants because it was held and locked in this human stress pattern, which certainly would have included in that circumstance active curses set on the land, as well as the presence of numerous ghosts. So we can see what happens in plant life in that way with a stressed and traumatised landscape. Animals will tend to avoid. Historically in Scotland, you build your croft house where the collie dog or the sheep or the cattle will lie down. Don't follow a Labrador. They'll go anywhere that you go. They're loving, but they're not that smart. But a collie dog won't stay. And often when I'm working on a house that's got a particularly intensely stressed area, the dogs won't go in there. And if you shut them in there, they'll howl and scrabble and scrape at the door to try and get out. So you can observe movement patterns with animals. I've seen a number of places with an extreme trauma pattern where birds won't go onto the site, even orchards where the fruit will fall and rot on the ground and no bird or animal will come to lift or take it. And then with people, as mentioned before, we can hold our presence peacefully regardless of what's going on, but if we let our guard down, or after a few days living and sleeping in place, we tend, as Colin was saying, we tend to come into a phase entrainment or a sympathetic resonance with the environment. So whatever our triggers are that are similar to what is being held in the landscape will tend to get triggered, whether that's jealousies or rage or insecurities or whatever that is. So you'll tend to see a repeating pattern, and that can look like repeated business failures every 2 years. That's quite a common pattern in a stressed business environment. Or one of the houses that I worked in had managed to divorce every couple that had moved into it within a 2-year period. Over 5, they called me. They said, "We just bought this house. The last 4 people all sold it because they got divorced in 2 years. Can you come and fix it?" I was out of the country. I got there a month later, at which point he was there alone because they got divorced and she'd moved out and the house was for sale again. So you'll tend to see a repeat, and the history of the place will tell you what's going on like that. So that would be my sort of observation of.
So Jill, how's this come up for you then? How's it impacting the people that you work with?
Well, one of the things I've found, and it's interesting that Patrick mentioned divorced couples. When I've taught in America, which I have a lot over the years, I found where people can buy property. Here you buy houses, but there they buy property. And often build houses. You know, people will come together, get married, and try to build a house together, but usually get divorced before it's built. And so what I have been doing over the years is having people honour the land, which is something so fundamental and something which was always done. You know, in England, people, you'd never. In fact, when we had in our area, we had some steps put down, and we live in London, and we restored some steps down into the basement, and we had an Irish builder. This was, 30 years ago now. And he put a coin in the bottom of the staircase, as a matter of course. I mean, he didn't even think about it. But so honouring the spirits of the place, and clearing out wells is another one, because often wells get full of rubbish, and so the source of water on your land is very important if you've got land. To clear the source of water, particularly clear out wells so that there's a sort of flow. And in these couples that get divorced and usually try and sell their property before they finish building their house on it, is to honour the spirits of the place. So I think this is really essential, especially if you're going to break ground for the first time, because the land is full of spirits and entities that have lived there forever. And we march in and assume that it belongs to us, this idea of property, which is extraordinary, really. And so I think it's very important if you're moving into a new place to honour the spirits of the place, which is done by all traditions everywhere and has been done historically. And I think we need to restore that.
So, Colin, from a traditional perspective, then honouring the spirits of the place, is that something that is done regularly where you are?
It's a complicated subject because, first of all, in southern Africa, there's a differentiation between the spirit of a place or the spirit of land and a land spirit. They're different things. So I want to illustrate this by just relating a story which actually happened here, just relatively close. Well, down in Devon actually. I was teaching at the Shoemaker College in 2014, and one of the things I like to do is a lovely path that runs along the river all the way from Dartington into town, and I used to like walking along it, and it was one of my favourite things to do each day. And one day when I was walking along it, I had just come to the point where the road leaves the Dartington estate and heads on, the path heads on along the river. And there's a point at which the path bifurcates, and the one path goes down towards the river. It must originally have been a way of fording the river, but it's a relatively disused path. And the other path is the main path that everybody's riding their bicycles along and walking their dogs and so on, and it's the path that I tended to walk on. And as I approached this spot, it was in midsummer, and it was quite a heavily shaded spot. But I noticed, to my surprise, that there was a very clearly demarcated, perfect circle of darker earth underneath the tree. And I looked at this and I thought, but who would have done this? Has somebody come here and actually, brought different soil in and demarcated this circle here? In the meantime, people were happily sort of riding across it and walking their dogs across it and pushing their prams across it as if nothing at all strange was happening. So I wandered towards it, and I bent down to have a look. And as I bent down, I began to get this really intense feeling coming through me. It was I could feel my body temperature change. I started sweating. I started shaking. I could feel my eyes were sort of pulsating. These are not unfamiliar experiences to me. I have them regularly in different circumstances. But in your terms, I guess I'd be saying I was resonating with something that was going on there. So, what's important? My first thought was, well, whatever this is, this place is traumatized. There's some sort of trauma here. Because this doesn't feel good in me. However, what is important here is that back in Southern Africa, what I had been taught and learned through the time of being trained is that relationship evokes intensity. And intensity has a limited number of ways in which it can manifest in the body. So it manifests often if it's an exciting process, if it's an excitement of the body. So we start producing adrenaline, and the heart rate goes up, and the body temperature changes. We become a little bit feverish. We become a bit disoriented. This is just the body's way of responding to intensity. It doesn't necessarily mean it's responding to trauma, because what we know in Southern Africa is that the way in which we often respond to the otherness of spirits, for example, is by a change in the intensity that we experience in the interaction. It's not necessarily trauma. It's not necessarily negative. In our culture, I think we have a tendency to pathologize alterations in body process. When we feel these kinds of symptoms, when we feel this intensity turn into biophysical, what we experience as biophysical stress, we assume something's wrong. But actually, what I quickly realized in this instance is that this place was an entity of some description. It's what we would call in Southern Africa a land spirit. So it wasn't the spirit of the place, it was a land spirit. And that is the effect that land spirits often have. They have a very particular potency, and that potency registers, and the physiology in me experiences that in a range of different familiar ways. We can understand this also in the sense that for example, when we experience excitement, joy, a joyful excitement, possibility, the biophysical response to that is not necessarily different from when we experience something really frightening. It's a raise in heartbeat, it's a change in mental state, it's change in body temperature and so on. But it's the manner in which we interpret it that decides how we're going to respond to it. And so too, when we encounter a spirit, a land spirit, and we get these changes in the physiology, the first instinctual response from a Western cultural perspective is, oh, hang on, wait, something's wrong here. I don't feel good. This intensity is not making me feel good. I feel a loss. I feel a bit dizzy. I feel disoriented. I feel a kind of anxiety coming into the solar plexus. I feel this doesn't feel good. But that is just intensity. So one of the things that we were taught when growing up in the Southern African tradition was that we shouldn't necessarily rush to a response of pathologizing that and saying there's something wrong here or that there's something traumatic going on. There's a relational process happening. So what we also know is that for the most part, these land spirits mediate between the spirit of the land and the rest of nature. So whatever encounters and whatever's going on, they're somehow intermediaries between it. So for the most part, when we encounter land, we're not encountering the land spirit, at least the spirit of the land, we're encountering the land spirit. So traditionally what would be said is the land spirit, the spirit of the land itself, is quite distant and very different to the nature of most other spirits. And I'm speaking animistically here in the sense that everything has a spirit, in the sense that it's very different and very difficult to actually access or respond or understand. But through the mediation of land spirits, between the spirits of the land and us, we can interact with it. So what you'll then generally find is there's certain places in Southern Africa, for example, sacred sites, what we call sacred sites, what are referred to generally as sacred sites are sites where there's a certain kind of potency, and that varies, the different kinds of potency for different places. And there's a way in which people used to interact with these places, because this was a way, these particular places were ways, they had various ways in which relating to the land and to nature and to the cycles of nature could happen. But inevitably, each of these sites would have land spirits occupying it, and most of the interaction was with the land spirits. So now, when we come to this issue of trauma or traumatized land, here it becomes very complicated, and I can really only speak from my own experience here and say to you that I definitely experience land as being traumatized, but I don't experience that trauma directly as the land spirit's trauma, as the spirit of the land's trauma, sorry, but rather I experience it as the trauma of the land spirit. So the land spirit is traumatized. So an example, a couple of years ago, I went back to visit one of the most important sacred sites in I would say in Southern Africa. It's a place called the Tsolilo Hills. It's in the northwestern part of Botswana. And my brother and I spent most of our childhood there learning from traditional elders. It's a very, very important site. And Southern Africa has been subject to an absolute tidal wave, as is the rest of the world, of, I suppose, what I would call globalizing, industrializing forces. And things have changed very, very dramatically in a very short space of time. And when we go to these sites, and when I went to this particular site, my immediate experience is that there is something terribly wrong. Because what is happening is the site, as it does, is amplifying, and the spirits that occupy that site are amplifying the general trauma that is hitting Southern Africa, this globalizing force that is annihilating, that is bulldozing vast tracts of land, felling forests, mining randomly and all over, destroying diversity, putting fences up to prevent animals from migrating, and just creating utter and complete havoc. And that's a trauma to the land, without a question. And the sacred sites, and more particularly the land spirits that occupy that, are reflecting that. So when you go to one of these sacred sites, it's a dreadful experience. And that in itself is traumatizing, because this is a place I love, this is a place I grew up in, had a very deep relationship and felt a symbiosis in that relationship. When I went there was a complete retractedness, there was an isolation, Everything that expresses isolation, retraction, loss, deprivation was triggered in me in that moment. And there was a perturbation of everything in me in relation to an experience of a perturbatedness of the land spirits that occupy that sacred site. So I think this is a complex subject, and I think how we respond to it is also complex. But the biophysical response to that complexity is generally quite simple. So differentiating what is going on becomes a very tricky business. And traditional cultures in Southern Africa have developed very, very sophisticated ways of identifying exactly what is going on, exactly what is being dealt with, exactly what is being experienced, and then therefore working with it.
Okay. Patrick, thank you, Colin. I'm going to come to you, Patrick, then. So, bringing it back to farmers, growers, people that are working on the land, in your experience, given what Colin has said, is this something we need to be watching out for? Is it a problem? How do we work with it given that we don't have the understandings and the technologies of perhaps the indigenous traditions of South Africa, or indeed our own indigenous traditions? What's the best way of working with these things? Do we need to?
Absolutely essential to. And I think in our cultural matrix, I 100% agree with everything that Colin's articulated. We would be speaking of the elementals, the nature spirits, the devic community, and absolutely distinct from the underlying genius loci, the community of vibrational beings, the elementals, earth, air, fire, and water, keepers of all the companion spirits of plants and animals. And that's certainly where the trauma can sit. The issue is communication and relationship, and I think Jill and Colin have both spoken to this. Partly what is stressful is that we no longer communicate with them, and everywhere in the landscape, always, forever, we have been in regular and intimate and constant communication with the spirits around us, the spirits of nature. They are our cooperative helpers in every endeavor that we do. But we have our beta, alpha, theta, delta brain states. The beta is the analytic, cognitive. The alpha is the intuitive. The theta is the dreaming. And then delta is the deep subconscious. Elemental spirits, their frequency bandwidth is in the dreaming, in the theta state, and the plant spirits and animal spirits primarily are in the alpha state, in the intuitive state. Not many of them come into our cognitive frequency, and because we're trained that intelligence means rational cognitive thought, we've abandoned the primary intelligence, which is our global three-dimensional intuitive relational wisdom intelligence. And so when a European university-trained person is thinking the nature spirits have no idea what's going on. For them, it's like looking at the shadow of a boat on the surface from a diver underwater. Is it a fishing boat? It's a warship? Don't know. Kids out for a party on a lilo. Could be anything. See, it's there. There's no cognitive connection. And so our daily practices, our intuitive mindfulness in the landscape, all of our seasonal festivals historically are for the purpose of coming into deep communion and intimate connection and mind and heart sharing with the creative intelligences of the landscape, both elemental and nature spirit. If we don't do that, they don't know what we're up to. And just as Colin's been articulating, the relationship is disconnected and our actions become completely introverse and in no way married to or in communion or cooperation with the forces that we're actually working with and that hopefully will work with us. So certainly there are healing techniques, many and various, for addressing traumas in the landscape. It's got a body the same as a person's body. Any healing technique that works on a person, works on a plant, works on a landscape. You just have to adapt for both geographical and time scale. So there's any number of ways we can heal specific issues, curse release, spirit release, etc. But the issue is relationship. The issue is communication. And what we need to do is what all of our ancestors did all over the world. We don't need to look outside of the UK to find people who talk to the landscape. It's very, very recent, and Rupert was mentioning on Tuesday, growing up and still the blessing of the plough, the blessing of the fields, the blessing of the harvest. We've really only lost this in the last 30 years here. So we don't need to go to the Amazon to find people who talk to nature spirits. You are those people. Your parents, your grandparents did this right here forever. And what we need to do, whoever you are indigenous to your place now. And the spirits that you need to be speaking to are the spirits of your place, and you need to do it today, and you need to do it every day, because that is your primary relationship. Our primary relationship is with place. Our secondary relationship is with identified work, and our third relationship, in fact, is with other people. Don't tell your husbands and wives that, but your primary relationship always is with place, and just the same as with a marriage, you only need to say I love you once and then you're good for life, right? Now, apparently you need to say that every day multiple times. So the solution to all of this is to get back into conversation with the elemental and nature spirits around you, the land spirits of Colin's languaging.
So that is easy for you to say, Patrick. I want to say, but sorry. Because you are a land whisperer. How do we go about that? I mean, you said some things there, blessing of the plough, things like that. How do each of us go and communicate with our land spirits? Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I spent a long time studying Tibetan Buddhism and travelling in the Himalayas, and there the primary temples in all the places that in the Himalayas are the temples to the guardian spirits of the place. I mean, these are primary, and then the other temples are subsidiary. And in fact, once in Bhutan, I discovered this tiny little temple in a field, and we had to go and find the farmer who was sort of barefoot with a big key to open it up, and it was very tiny. And I had an amber mala, and within seconds of arriving in this temple, it burst, and all the seeds, all the beads disappeared. So honouring the spirits of the place there, and those would be the land spirits, they would be the spirits of the place, the guardians, the protectors. They're known as the protectors, and they're absolutely primary. And I think maybe the saints of the parish have become the protectors of the place. One of the things that in the case of these two particular women who'd inherited farms that I worked with, whose constellations were completely chilling, it started me off on this journey of discovery of the bones. With one of them, I had her get the local priest to do a requiem mass on the land to put the spirit, to honour the spirits of those whose bodies had been distributed over the land, and that definitely made a difference. And one time when I was with Rupert and we were near his birthplace, there's a battlefield, the Battle of East Stoke, where about 4,000 people died, and there I asked the local vicar to do a requiem mass for the spirits of those who died in that place. So, in this country, I think it's a so-called originally spiritual Christian country. There are tools available within that tradition still surviving, and as you say, the irrigation Sunday was something in the church, and actually I was doing a ceremony around the mandala. Which is a very complex diagram of the mind with the four directions and multiple meanings, which was when Rupert came, and we then went to the local church and they had Rogation Sunday, and they were honouring in the four directions. So I think that's very much embedded in the spiritual tradition of this land.
It strikes me then, I'm just picking up from all of you, that it is really about communication, and through all our different traditions in our different lands and countries and ancestries, we have these ways of communicating, but actually it's really about our individual communication with our place. You're talking about getting the priest to do it, but we all have the possibility to do that ourselves. Patrick, can I come back to you then, just with that question of how do we each go about doing that in whatever place we come from, whether we farm, grow, or just live on a piece of land?
Yeah. Well, I think it's literally the most natural thing in the world for a human being to do. And so you come pre-programmed with all the speed dials already set in your software. It's literally a question of accessing a deeply peaceful place inside and allowing the busy mind to set aside and to move into observer mind. Observer mind is qualitative mind, is soul mind, is connected. Executive mind, analytical mind, is body mind, is by its nature and its task introverted and self-referential. So we move into peaceful space, we move into observer mind, observing the breath, observing the temperature, observing the sounds, observing the clouds, observing the birds, and then moving into heart space, and then literally whatever we hold in mind, we automatically create a resonance with. We create a rapport with, we create a connection with. Literally, all you need to do is get into a heart space and hold a thing in mind. As you feel the connection establishing, you energize that with pure, simple love until you feel the rapport. And then at that point, you are at that point in an inevitable telepathic communication. Whatever entity or agency of intelligence you've connected with can read your thoughts. And your dialogue then is to allow your thoughts to be read, to express them clearly either as a thought or an image or a feeling, and then to deeply observe the response that comes back, which is going to be received as a reciprocal thought, feeling, or image given to you that then appears in your own mind. So I say hello to the field. I let it know how much I love it. I let it know that we're going to come in a couple of weeks and plant carrots. And then I'm going to open my mind and listen to whatever the field has to tell me. And maybe it's going to give me an image of, don't plant yet, the weather's not going to be right. Or it's an image of, that sounds great, but we could do with a top dressing of compost. Or it's going to come back to me with some information that then is mine to take action on. But its communication comes as a thought or a feeling, an image, an inspiration, or just from nowhere, a deep inner knowing. So that's how it works. It's super simple. We get into a peaceful, loving space. You simply hold in mind whatever it is you want to communicate with, energize that relationship with love until you feel a rapport, and then you simply have a conversation in your imagination, and that's the job of your imagination. And the reason that we don't do that is because we've been trained not to trust our imagination. We've been trained to believe that what happens in the imaginal space is pure fantasy. There are dark reasons why we've been told that. If somebody is in full possession of their imaginal powers, you cannot in any way control that person. That is your sovereign superpower. That is how you connect with any deity, any intelligence, any other agency at all. So absolutely trust everything that comes to your imagination. That is the organ of your psyche that is designed and facilitated to connect and communicate with all universal and cosmic intelligences. So peaceful place, heart space, energize the connection with love, express and communicate, and then listen deeply and trust what comes into your imagination, because that is the reciprocal communication. And then your human agency is to take action accordingly, I think.
Thank you, Patrick. And just before I open up, Colin, would you add anything to that? How we can communicate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I come back to my experience on the path in the river, my experience initially was that this particular spirit was, in some sense, it was traumatized, although it was difficult to decide whether it was traumatized or whether it was merely trying to get my attention or whether I was merely resonating with its nature. And so my instinctual response was what I usually do, which is to acknowledge it. So, I kind of kneeled down beside the path to everyone's surprise as they were walking past. And I took some tobacco out and I put it down. And there was a continuation of the exacerbation of these experiences in me. So it wasn't really changing things. And I think one of the things we can say about trauma per se is that the trauma response, or the activation of trauma, or technically the abreaction of the trauma, happens when an action takes place outside of the traumatized individual or place or whatever it is, that somehow triggers that trauma response. So clearly something was triggering this place, this particular spirit. And what I realized, what it felt to me was happening, was that nobody was taking any notice of it. They were just walking across it and pushing their prams across it, and their dogs were, and there was absolutely no recognition that anything or anyone was there. And one of the things that we know in Southern Africa about these traumatized states is that one of the most healing things we can do is just to acknowledge, just to say, I see you. I see you. And I recognize you, and I hear you. And there's a kind of a reaching out that happens in that. And that is, in my experience, immediately ameliorative to trauma, because the trauma response is often a reaching out for just that. Because there's a feeling of isolation, it wants some kind of interaction. The complex is driving at finding relationship, restoring relationship. So the act of recognizing it immediately did begin to exacerbate it, but I realized that it wasn't exacerbating the trauma response, it was actually exacerbating the relational space between us. So in fact, I was just having a relationship with it, even though I was identifying it in myself as a trauma response. But what I did realize also was that it wanted a particular thing of me. And so the next time I went, instead of giving it tobacco, because I'd done a little bit of research back at the college, and they said, one of the oldest things that's offered here are oats. Take some oats, because I'd spoken to a number of people about this. And so the next time I went down, sure enough, there was the same demarcation in the ground, and there was the same feelings that came up, and I knelt down and I offered it oats, and I spoke to it as best I could. I spoke to it in both English and the traditional language that I speak from Botswana, not knowing what it would, if anything, understand, but probably at least the intention. And sure enough, there was a kind of a calming down. And thereafter, every time I walked past this place, I would religiously do this. And over time, it disappeared. Now, I don't know if that's the result of what I was doing or not, but there was a sense of a kind of a calming of the place, a calming of that whole area. So this is a very simple thing we can do. We can simply acknowledge. And, you know, of course, I wanted to stand up and say to all the people riding, hey, hang on, wait. You can't just ride across here. You know, stop, get off your bicycle. Just recognize that there's somebody here that you're riding over. Nobody wants to be just ridden over, you know, and walk past as though you don't exist. You know, the worst trauma is the feeling of not existing in a social circumstance. So to ameliorate trauma, respond. Acknowledge, recognize, offer, open the relational space. That's the most healing thing we can do.
Jill, you want to say
Well,
something there?
I absolutely agree with that. And just to... So we don't offer because we don't believe that there's anybody other than we. We just think that we're the most important beings. And so... you know, who would we offer to? But just to give an example, with family constellations, where I'm working with transgenerational traumas, I started that work because I discovered that through honouring the ancestors, whoever they may be, the blood ancestors, people's lives were changing dramatically just by honouring them, because until then they would clamour for attention. They have no agency. Unless we say in the armistice, we will remember you. So somehow, socially, we know that the ancestors need to be remembered. There's a kind of need there. And we all know that, but we sort of forget it. It's a forgetting. And so what I noticed was, as soon as we started honouring the ancestors, they became mentors and guides, and people's lives changed dramatically. And so it's just a question of realising that we're not the only beings there. There are other beings who existed long before we did, and just as you were saying, to offer them flowers or water, or and particularly I found in terms of the land is if we honour the local body of water to where we are, if it's going to the beginning of the source of a river, if a river runs by us, or if we have a lake, or any water source, because water spirits are traditionally extraordinarily powerful beings and can be a little dodgy unless we acknowledge them. And so honouring our local water spirits is something very easy to do, and just to have the humility to acknowledge that there might actually be other beings that are more important and older and existing on other levels than our rational or rather foolish little rational minds' discursivity allows us to perceive.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, anybody with any questions? I'm aware as well that we've got a live stream, so should we do that one first, and then I can see some hands here.
It's complicated, so bear with me. Okay, trauma and land. Is it only human emotional intensity? Can you hear me, actually? It's better now.
Yes.
It's to find my own. Is it only human emotional intensity that can result in land trauma, or do other organisms and beings contribute positively or negatively? And looking into the effects of industrial contamination on health ecologies, are there case examples where ongoing contamination causes encapsulation? Out with that, could you share some biomarker examples?
Blimey, that sounds like a few questions. Patrick, the first of those questions, which I've actually forgotten, felt like it needed to come to you. Is it only human emotional intensity that causes trauma? Industrial contamination, you talked about quarrying, things like that.
Yes. Well, it would probably depend how we, as Colin referred earlier, how we define trauma. The self-repeating cycles of trauma that we get tied into do tend to be sourced from human action, human intention, or human emotion. In intense and potentially tragic circumstances of a natural origin, the hurricane, the wildfire, whilst those have an effect on the landscape, often when you review the landscape after the fire has gone by, after the earthquake has gone by, after the tsunami has retreated, there's actually a refreshment and a reset in a landscape. So the patterns in the sand that human beings leave, I think because of our free will, and also because of our attachment to circumstantial time, those repeat and self-replicating trauma patterns mostly source from us. If we contaminate a landscape with chemicals, if we industrially pollute, it degrades that landscape, it can degrade the life forces, but it's not a self-replicating embedded pattern. So that's a different category of thing, I think. So
that kind of answers the other animals question as well, that you feel it's mainly human.
Animals under stress seem to do fight and flight and then let go of it. People under stress do fight and flight and then hold on to it.
Cool, there's a whole big subject that we could go into there, isn't there? Human and land interaction, but next time perhaps. I saw other hands here. Whoa, where to start? Perhaps this one here.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about breaking the repetitive trauma, because obviously if there is a repetitive trauma, that's something that we engage with. And so what can you do to release that trauma?
Colin, would you like to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the thing about trauma is it has a lock and key scenario in terms of the response and what it is that sets, that interacts, that triggers the response. So going back to the sites on the path, the extent to which people were continuing to walk over it and ride and cycle over it, each time there was a lack of acknowledgement. It was a re-triggering of that trauma, a re-experiencing of that trauma, essentially. So one way to mitigate that is to identify what it is that is doing the traumatizing, the action that is doing the traumatizing usually. So it's not just our emotions that cause the triggering, it's what we do. So in this instance, this continuous walking across it and lack of acknowledgement and lack of recognition that it was there is a traumatizing trigger. So the moment we change that and we say, okay, well, let's respond differently, let's recognize you, let's see that you're there, let's make an offering, that breaks the repetitive cycle. The lock and key no longer turns and the trauma response is mitigated through that process.
Save our marriages.
Definitely. It boils down to consciousness, essentially, to become aware of what it is that's doing the triggering. And that's often not an easy business. And sacred sites, I just have to say this, sacred sites are also, this is relating to the first question, they're amplifiers of a general condition in a place. So sacred sites is not a very good term for them, but anyway, these powerful places. So an example of that at the Tsorilo Hills is shortly before I arrived there the last time, an added trauma that had happened there is that a herd of elephants had come into the Tsorilo Hills, and they had gone rampantly pushing down trees. And some of the old, some beautiful old Mugongo trees and various other trees that are there. It's a place of beautiful trees. These trees had just been, and apparently, according to people who live there, they were there for 7 days, and they wreaked havoc. No one could go anywhere near. They just pushed trees down. And there was a clear sense of an utter traumatizing of the place as a result of this. But what we can also recognize is that part of the reason that the elephants were doing this was because their paths of migration have been blocked, they've been harassed, they've been hunted, they've been pushed into smaller and smaller areas, and they're having this response because of that, essentially. But what you're seeing there is a kind of a cumulative effect of trauma responses, and it specifically seems to be amplified in these particular places of potency. So traditionally, we would recognize that when we want to know what the state of the general land is, we look at the sacred sites, we see what's going on there, we see what's happening, we see what the interactions are. We recognize, we become conscious of the so-called traumas there, and we can work with them there in order to ameliorate it in the rest of the land.
Wonderful, thank you.
I have two questions. One very brief for you, Jill. Can you clarify, there was one term you used, it was a black spot or something about a space that, I can't remember what you said exactly. But what is that?
It's an expression, an accident black spot.
An accident black spot. What is that, please? And then I have a second
so an
question
accident
for
black spot is a name for a place where there are a lot of car accidents, usually.
Oh, okay.
And so what's been found is that places that were traditional battlefields, going back to the Middle Ages, for example, often became places where a lot of cars smashed into each other and people died. Okay. So this is, sort of continuity through generations of habitual places of death, for example.
Thank you. Okay. And then this question is for anyone who'd like to answer it. I'm wondering, can you describe to us what happens on the edge of the spaces, your space, when you're doing clearings? So is there when you're doing a clearing on a specific piece of land, what happens at the edges of where you can reach to? And can you reach infinitely or not? And what, can you talk to us about that, please?
Patrick, that sounds like one
That
for you.
one mine. So that's really a question of ethic in terms of what do I have permission to work with. The one definition of the edge between black magic and white magic, for example, is whether or not your action compromises another person's free will. And so we have to navigate that. I was trained in two schools of ethic. One was anything you do without conscious verbal permission of the person involved, your karma is toast. And the other school was you're on the planet for a short time, you should be healing and blessing everything that comes to mind and attention, otherwise your karma is toast. So apparently either way, it'll be toast. So you get to choose. I think we can confidently work to the edges of a property boundary for a client. I find, just as Colin's saying too, sometimes it really is just an on-site problem. Something bad or sad happened there, you can fix it, the job's done. Very often it is in fact part of or reflective of something in the wider landscape. And then you kind of got to look God in the eye and see what she tells you to do about it. I think that ethically it's always safe and appropriate to purely and simply love without agenda. When we purely and simply love, we energize the true nature, the soul, the essence of a thing. And probably, mostly in truth, that's all we ever really need to do to achieve a healing outcome. All healing ultimately is some functional process of compassionate witness. So by witnessing a thing and purely and simply loving it without agenda, not trying to fix it, not trying to change it, not trying to impose your projected idea of how it should be better, that's a true healing process. If we've been given invitation or permission to imprint intention, we're imprinting this to be a really great field of carrots, or we're imprinting it to be a fantastic cafe or a wonderful, retail business. We've been given that permission to imprint intention. Outside of that, pure, simple love, that's always karmically clean, including, your worst enemies who actually need love more than anybody else, because we need to create that rapport and see their pure soul rather than whatever their disfiguration of egoic compromise might be. So you're allowed to love the planet purely and simply, and then you're allowed to intend upon anywhere you've got permission or invitation to. And I would just say, you can consciously choose to be intentional about places that you don't have permission or invitation to. You just need to understand once you do that, you become involved karmically in that process, which may be your life path. That's not a bad thing. We give our lives to political agenda, to agricultural revolution, to restoring justice. So we do that consciously and we do that actively, but we just need to be aware that when we do that, when we engage intentionally, then we become part of that process. So pure, simple love is safe and probably ultimately most effective anyway.
Right. Guy.
Hi there. Thanks so much. This is wonderful. There's been talk about how the individual can connect and honour. And I'm just thinking, you also mentioned seasonal festivals and the collective honouring it. And I feel in Britain, I work for the British Pilgrimage Trust, and one thing I've noticed is that there's an issue around Christianity as opposed to Druidry, as opposed to all the other different spiritual traditions. And, I mean, I do work with Rupert on this patronal festival grant scheme. We give money to parishes so they can celebrate their patron saint, the protective land spirit. But there's underlying that, there's this kind of Christianization of the land spirit, which some people find really tricky in the fact that they did that anyway, and they didn't just honour the land spirit for its own sake. And I just wonder, do you have any experience of healing this Christian Druid, however you want to put it, divide, the way that we devilize? There are so many stories of the devil in the landscape which relate to protective land spirits, and it's just maybe the Christian church saying, don't go and worship that land spirit and turn it into a devil. And I just feel there's so much confusion, but if we're actually going to make this collective and everyone honour it and we've got to solve this. And I just wonder what you have to say about that.
Who would like to go for that?
Well, I just like to say I think acknowledging the other as equal, if not more powerful than we are, whoever the other is and by whatever tradition we do it, I think is beyond any tradition. And I mean, in all parts of the world, one of the great religions moved in over an originally more shamanic, existing shamanic tradition, for example. And so, which doesn't mean that the earlier traditions are demonic, of course. So I think, but going beyond any notions of any particular tradition, it's important just to acknowledge the other as equal or more powerful than we are.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can say a little bit. I think, technically speaking, projection is always a tricky thing, and it's inevitable. So when we encounter the other, the tendency would be to project a vision of who we think the other is immediately and respond to them in that term. The difficult part about that is the other often feels othered by that. In other words, there's a sense in which the relational space breaks down because the other doesn't feel seen, because I'm projecting onto them my vision of who I think they are, which doesn't necessarily calibrate with who they know themselves to be. So traditionally in Southern Africa, one of the very important things when interacting with, for example, land spirits and the spirit of the land in general, is to learn about the place, to learn about the nature of that spirit. And yes, absolutely, the acknowledgement is the first port of call with this. But then from there, traditionally it would be understood that if you learn about the spirit and you learn about its ways and you begin to respond to it in accordance with its ways, then a mutuality is established in the relationship, and that in itself is a trauma, is an amelioration of trauma. The other feels seen in that.
Shall we go to the next one?
I would just like to speak to that. I think it would be good if we all just let go of all the traditions and wiped it off. We're not trying to regain traditional knowledge. We're not trying to replicate anything that happened before. Relationship happens live in present time, here and now. So if you're doing something vestigial because you think that's what your granddad did, that's not being here now. And as we said, the essence of relationship is love, and it's in present time. And so the quest for ancient knowledge and the quest for traditional wisdom, it's all around you now, instantly. Tune in, plug in, download, proceed. It doesn't matter what the Druid did. It doesn't matter. We can remember that Christianity started as a desert shamanic cult. Fast for 40 days in the desert, have your best mate hold your head underwater till you either drown or see God. Doesn't matter which happens first, you're going to see God anyway. That's very personally direct, experiential. So it's relationship, it happens in present time, it happens in response to the environment that we're in, so it's always local. And culture arises from the landscape we're in. All of these traditions are based on what was needed, as Colin said, to respond to the land spirits of that place. Our seasonal festivals were seasonal. The cross-quarter days are seasonal movable feasts. You don't celebrate Beltane till the hawthorn blossoms. You don't celebrate Samhain till the first frost. It's not a calendrical. It's a landscape relational response. So this is all in present time. And just if I may, my mum, healer from birth, founded a healing center, ran a healing center, learned radionics, spinal adjustments, homeopathy, reflexology, aromatherapy. And I have an ultimate memory of her in her agedness, sitting in the armchair next to the fire, whiskey in her hand, Labrador in her lap. And she's being told about this marvelous new copyrighted healing technique that's been created and it's going to be better than anything else that ever was. And she patiently smiles and nods, and she strokes the Labrador, and she takes a sip of her whiskey, and she says, I wonder how many words we'll come up with for love. Oh. And I think we need to remember that. All of our traditions are human creations around a loving relationship with spirit. And as long as we hold that in the center, think you get to wear white robes, purple robes, any way you want. They don't care. That's another thing to remember. The spirits aren't responding to your ritualistic behavior. They're responding directly to your intention. They're reading your thoughts directly. They're not interpreting your actions. They're reading your thoughts directly. So it's what's in heart and mind that is the essence of what these things are for and therefore.
Jill, do you want to...
Well, there is, I think, what Colin was saying about the land itself creating the context, and there's a couple of examples of that, which is that it has been observed that that certain people in North America begin to look like First Nation North America or American Indians, and in fact there was an anthropologist, Franz Boas, who did something very interesting. He in the days when people believed that skull shapes told us everything, measured the skull shapes of a Italian community in North America where they hadn't married out, and he found that the skull over generations, the skulls of this Italian community that hadn't married out, gradually over the generations came to look more and measure more like cultural Native Americans. So there is something about the land itself bringing about certain ways of being. Life is full of unanswerable mysteries.
We have time for one last question. This one down here.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering,
Jill, you mentioned earlier that there are beings that are stronger, more powerful than us. And I recognise that I carry a trauma of having had negative experience with demonic entities. And I was just wondering, when you enter places where there are strong forces, most recently I had an experience at Montserrat near Barcelona, would you advise, is there a protection practice or an acknowledgement of these beings that might be present? Or if you go with the presence of love, as Patrick mentioned, is that enough?
Well, I think the Pope used to kiss the tarmac of the aerodrome that he landed in. I think honouring the spirits of the place when you arrive in a new place is very important, which is either kissing the tarmac or making offerings to the river. So I think going into any new place, it's very important to honour the spirits of that place who have existed long before people who came there, and certainly long before you arrived. So I think that mitigates any negativity that you might then experience.
Colin, Patrick, any last thought on that? Making new relationships with places. What's the best thing to do?
Well, the issue of predatory or demonic spirits is a real one, and I don't think we have time in this context to explore that deeply. I think rather than walk in fear and think in terms of protection, we want to walk with love and be streetwise. You can get hurt in Oxford if you step in front of a bus. Or you might walk the streets of Oxford and get mugged. So there's a certain amount of street smart of don't go down the dark alley on your own at night and don't walk in front of the bus. I think that we have companion spirits who in Christian tradition we would call a guardian angel, and it's good to keep in close communication with those personal companion spirit helpers, spirit guides. They're on team to help with that. And sometimes, with the best will in the world, we get slimed. To use the term from the Ghostbusters, and that's why we have healers in the community. That's their job, is to check you for ticks and proceed accordingly. So I think, as Jill was saying, right relationship, make sure you're entering into a place with permission of the guardian spirit there, rather than showing up as an intruder. Keeping companion angels close in touch, following their guidance, and then if it feels like something didn't go right, then go and get yourself hosed down and blessed properly by somebody who's in the community with those skills. I don't know, what would you?
Yeah, no, I think that you said it beautifully. I mean, so traditionally in Southern Africa, there's a notion that there are places you just don't go, there are places you keep away from. And there are people within the community who are designated mediators between people, land, and nature. And they're the people who are looked to often to tell the rest of the community where you can go and where you don't. It doesn't necessarily mean these places are demonic. A hungry lion is just a hungry lion. It's not demonic. And some places, they have difficult spirits, or they have hungry spirits, or they have spirits that are potentially going to cause us harm, and we keep away from those places.
Wonderful, thank you.
And just want to say what you said about fear. Yesterday, Rupert and I, a few others, went to Christchurch for Evensong, and it was "Protect us from the fear of our enemies" was the prayer.
Well, thank you. Now that's a place to finish. Thank you so much all for coming. Thank you for our lovely panel.